also down in the trenches with our clients when things happen. I mean, when something has gone wrong, or also obviously trying to help them before anything goes wrong. But it's privacy and security. It's small but yet broad area. I think we have our fingers in almost everything nowadays. For instance, like M&A, compliance work, breaches like this. It's a lot of cross-border work as well, which makes me find it even more interesting to be in an international law firm like this. So you're also getting a lot of knowledge and insights from your colleagues around the world. Like that. And it's also consistently evolving, which makes this not boring at all.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll be talking about ransomware in different industries, as you can see, working against the clock. So more than 50% ransomware is targeting 3 industries: banking, retail, and utilities. However, every other industry is suffering equally when it comes to the impact of ransomware. So I would like to go straight to the questions, and it will be open. So the first question: who will pay the cost?
I think we know who's paying the cost already. We would want, I mean, the offenders to pay for it, but obviously it's the suffering entity that is being subjected to any kind of attack, and it's really hectic when it happens. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced it, because as we normally say, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and then also how. So they ending up paying. I mean, it's expensive. You need to mobilize a lot of internal and external resources, everything from communication, your management, your lawyers, your insurance company. So it's a dense ecosystem, said. And then who's paying? That's almost a topic by itself, but it's also involving a lot of insurances in this area. They are not entirely consistent in terms of what they cover. That's also something that could be good to know, I think. And also perhaps also have a look at your insurance coverage and see how that works. What do you think, Nicole, about cost allocation when these things happen?
It's very interesting because it's completely outside of our domain, but it's interesting you should mention the insurance industry, because a few days ago I was at a panel discussion where there was someone from, at least from a insurance company, and he was actually indicating that there were many companies that were just, in fact, considered uninsurable. So in that sense, if you are in a particular category of, or a particular industry, you might not even be able to be insured. So then you'll probably be the one who ends up paying for the costs. So in a way, though, it's also going to trickle down to the clients as well, especially considering the criminals are also extorting clients. So it's not just the actual victim, but also the clients of the victims. And on top of that, you have the added element of the fact that there's many third-party providers causing supply chain attacks. So then, in essence, I don't want to say everyone, but it's the victim plus all the people and organizations that the victim engages with. So, in essence, you could say all of us.
Yeah, then it's another cost that you may be subject to, and that is if you don't follow the GDPR and notify the regulators if you need to do so. Need to say that since I'm, advising in privacy and security, but that's also a fact. And there's also an increasing number of evolving data privacy laws outside of the European Union that would also oblige you as a company to report breaches. And what I would definitely not recommend is that you bribe or that you try to sweep it under the carpet, because that can really blow up in your face. And it's also associated with a lot of bad will. And if you are looking at companies when you are looking to invest, or if you're being a target for something like that, this is definitely something that we and other law firms would flag in our legal due diligence. So it will cost you in a lot of ways in the end.
Yep. Great, thank you very much. Yes, indeed. And I would also like to mention, because obviously when it comes to regular crime, there is a fear factor when it comes to the law enforcement agencies. But when it comes to cyber attack or ransomware, I mean, how you were involved and what was your part really here? How can you help, so to say?
So that's a really good question, and I like how you say there's a fear factor, because there are a lot of misconceptions about what happens when law enforcement becomes involved. And in effect, of course, we try to encourage reporting by companies that fall victim to ransomware attacks as much as possible, but we're also acutely aware of the fact that there's very little incentive to report, because it's not necessarily to deliver something for the company itself. The reason why we want the reporting, of course, is because I would say two reasons. We want to identify the perpetrators and ultimately arrest them, but we're also focusing on how can we destruct the infrastructure which makes it possible for them to even carry out those attacks. The challenge with law enforcement, of course, is if you report it, a lot of times there's no feedback. So what is the incentive of reporting? It's an additional burden. And we can also understand it's not top of mind. Top of mind is being able to access your data again and to get your company up and running again. So we do have to work on a bit of a promotional campaign to increase the reporting. And what we try to do from a law enforcement perspective, at least at Europol, is we have the JCAT, which is the Joint Cybercrime Action Task Force, which brings together what we call liaison officers from many different countries, both inside as well as outside the EU. I think my mic just went off. And we have had a lot of ransomware investigation cases. And the idea is that we don't just do them in silos, but we connect them to each other so we can actually see how are perpetrators attacking different companies in different countries. And the next step we're taking is what we call an international ransomware response model to be more proactive. So like I said, rather than just doing like an in-depth vertical investigation into one case, we try to bring everything together and also really focus on what we call high-value targets. What's needed obviously for that is that cooperation between the different countries, but also the cooperation from private companies. And the legal framework, and that goes to your question about regulatory frameworks. From a law enforcement perspective, that's why we always speak to the Commission. We try to emphasize that we need to be able to receive that data from private companies, and there are some legal challenges in that realm, and to be able to get it in a speedy way.
Thank you, Nicole. So what type of regulatory framework does industry need, you'd say?
I'm not sure if that's the thing. I mean, we already have the GDPR. If we are also depending on need for what we live. That's my first initial reaction to that. But I mean, in order to get it like public in a way, and also supervisory authorities for privacy, they're also very interested in this. So they want to, have insight about what's happening in society and the likes. But although they have said that we're not that interested in everyone's reporting if they sent one email wrong, if there's no like health data or similar into that. But what's needed? So that's one regulatory framework. But if you are looking for the kind of frameworks that would prevent the attacks targeting the antagonists, then I think I would defer to Nicole there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because it obviously not everything can be prevented. A lot of it is risk minimization, or at least early detection. I mean, if we look at the keynote of this morning by the CISO from SolarWinds, somebody asked, could it have been prevented? He said, well, we could have made it more difficult, but it couldn't have been prevented. And obviously, what's good to emphasize there is that it was, at least as to the extent they can attribute it, a state-sponsored attack. We obviously focus, to the extent we can, purely on criminal actors. But the idea is that when I speak to companies, so predominantly internet security providers, incident response, there is a lot more that could have been done to either prevent it or minimize the risk or minimize the damage. I don't think that's a mistake of the regulatory framework. If we also connect it, I'm not sure how many of you saw the keynote of Monica, but she had this evolution of the maturity model, and the first stage is regulatory driven. So if you purely do it to comply with regulation, you're not a very mature company. And obviously the fourth stage was evolution driven. So you look at different scenarios. So it is really about you as a company consciously making that effort. And I'm not saying that if you fall victim that you didn't make that effort. But what was really interesting, I think it was a subsidiary company of MasterCard looked at victims of ransomware, how they were doing when they were attacked, and then a year later, and they still didn't take the steps to sort of recover or remediate some of the vulnerabilities they had. So it shouldn't just be regulation, it should really be like that culture, I would say.
Yeah, that's also something that the Authority for Privacy Protection wouldn't like. You know that you have that gap and you didn't do anything to fill it. Also when you've been subjected to personal data breach in GDPR terms.
Great. So moving to the next question, what is the legal treatment of ransomware and other infections of IT systems
I mean, it is criminalized. Looking at Swedish case law, I'm a Swedish lawyer. Um, it's mostly about more targeted attacks. Like one person in the healthcare that is curious about what the neighbor has been seeking medical care for and the likes. And it's also some revenge actions towards previous partners and the likes. And there are a few attacks, for instance, towards the public transport in Skåne, southern of Sweden, and so. But other than that, it's a lot of companies that, as you indicated before, Nicole, that don't report it to the police when they have been subjected to attacks because they don't think that it would lead anywhere. And it's, as you also said before, and it's also another administrative burden when you already, it feels like everything is on fire anyway around you. So,
Great.
Have your way in there, Nicole, as well.
Well, yeah, like I said, we completely understand it's not top of mind, and I'm not necessarily sure if, to come back to this regulation and legal elements, if it would become mandatory. Of course, in a sense, it would be advantageous for law enforcement because then they would get more reports. But on the other hand, I'm not sure if mandatory reporting is really the way to go, considering there's already so much mandatory reporting going on for companies, and then it just becomes like sort of a world onto its own. I think we would hope that it would come from like a positive approach in terms of wanting to cooperate with law enforcement and wanting to make more of like a communal contribution, in the sense that by that intelligence you provide, it will help the entire criminal investigation in terms of identifying perpetrators.
Yeah, I can agree more, because I mean, we've noticed when it comes to many organizations, there is another fact that they're afraid of the defamation, like, if they're attacked, and they don't want to actually, disclose any sort of information or whatsoever. But then we've noticed in our previous conferences that, some of the banks came forward and actually mentioned they actually disclosed everything what happened, so the people can be educated and, we can work as a community against all these attacks. So if you could talk about a little bit about action plans, inform, investigate, document, maybe?
Yeah, that's. I was going to say, I'm going to take the credit and blame for that bullet point because I did that one. No, but that's a lot about how we work with our clients, pretty much. Like informing persons whose personal data you're processing, what you're doing, why you're doing it, who you're sharing it with, why you have the right to do it, and so on. And then also when something happens, then you also need to inform, like regulators and sometimes also the individuals concerned in severe cases, when you can assume that there would be some kind of damage or some detrimental effects to them, pretty much. Then investigate, you also have an obligation to understand or investigate what has happened and why. And there's also, as we touched upon before, an obligation under the GDPR to implement TOMS, technical and organizational measures, to protect personal data like that. So you really need to demonstrate that you have done so. But then that said, the GDPR does not prescribe any specifics in that respect. So that should be adapted to the sensitivity of the data that you're holding as a company. Then it's more data that you're holding and that is also sensitive, then you need to step up in terms of how you protect it. I mean, it makes sense. That's probably something that isn't new under GDPR. It's just codifying what should make sense, I think. And then also document, in order to, again, demonstrate what you have done so far. So you need to be able to show to the regulators and also other stakeholders and say what you have done and so on. So you will be able to respond in a clear and proper way.
So I don't have anything to add on action plans, but I'm going to take this opportunity, since we have very little time left, to plug No More Ransom. So for anybody who doesn't know it, No More Ransom has been in existence since 2016. It's an initiative by Europol, the Dutch police, and a number of private companies. And it does connect to this question because No More Ransom actually provides decryption tools for a number of ransomware families. And basically we have associate partners who are able to provide those decryption tools to us. So we always try to spread the message as broadly as possible in case somebody falls victim to ransomware, and we actually have a decryption tool available for that specific ransomware family version. It will allow the victim obviously to decrypt the data. And we're always happy to also onboard supporting partners who are there to amplify the message. So if you want to hear anything more about No More Ransom, please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you very much, Nicole. We are very, actually, 1 minute over. So just wanted to quickly wrap it up. I have a question outside of this questions that we have. So one of the questions, of course, you are dealing, Jennie, with cross-industry. So would you be able to shed some light, if it is possible for you to do it? Like, is there any sort of specific industry who you think, as, I mean, of course, like, you know, your clients may come, like, you know, for those sort of help from you, for example. Is there any specific industry would say that are most affected, or is it like pretty cross-industry when it comes to ransomware?
I'd say depends on the intent of the attacker, of course, but in general, it's industry that is holding a lot of data, and it also has a lot of money, because the attackers quite often they want to bargain.
Okay.
So I think that's one factor. Then the other one is that if it's some kind of organization that would be prestigious to get into.
Okay, great. Nicole, any final words?
Yeah, definitely to connect to that point. I mean, it's obviously big game hunting. There's a lot of reconnaissance before they actually attack someone who is able to pay, and who is going to have to pay because of its business.
Great. So I think this is a discussion that's never going to end. So would like to continue the discussion. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask the questions through the app, or you can meet them in person. So take the opportunity. We've waited too long to meet people in person. So thank you very much, Nicole and Jennie, for this wonderful conversation. And we're going to move to our next session now.
Thank you.